Hello, my math friends. This is Mrs. Schlecht, and in this video, we are going to solve multiplication and division equations. As always, my friends, you know that there's a few materials that you need in order to be successful for this activity. First, you're going to need your Envision book. We're still in volume 1. Second, you're going to need your math notebook to take those beautiful math notes and show all your wonderful math thinking. Third, you're going to need a pencil. And fourth, last but certainly not least, that positive math attitude. All right, my friends, so this video goes with lesson 4-4, which again helps us write and solve algebraic equations with multiplication and division. The key concepts page for this lesson is on page 206. All right, my friends, so if you think back to lesson 4-3, we were solving equations with addition and subtraction. And if you recall, in order to solve those equations, we kind of did the opposite of what was in our original equation, right? And don't forget, whatever we did to one side of our equal sign, we had to do the same thing to the other side of our equal sign to make sure that our equation stayed nice and balanced and so happy, right? But now we're dealing with multiplication and division. But did you know that multiplication is just the opposite of division and division is just the opposite of multiplication, right? So those are our two operations, my friends, that we're going to be using to isolate our variables so that we can find those solutions to those equations. So let's look at this first example. We have m, which is our variable, currently unknown. When I divide it by 5, my quotient, or the answer, is 7. Now think to yourself, how do I undo dividing by 5? Well, you multiply by 5. So we know that when we do anything to one side of our equation, we also need to do that same thing to the other side of our equation so that it stays the same, and that equal sign, which means that it's the same, keeps its value, right? It still means the same thing. So don't forget that when I divide by 5, but then I multiply by 5, that cancels each other out. So then we would just have m, which is our variable, all by itself. But then think to yourself, if I multiplied 5 over here, you also need to multiply 5 on this side. And what is 7 times 5? We know that 7 times 5 is 35. That means that m, our variable, is equal to 35. And that makes sense, my friends, right? Because when I have 35, I divide it by 5, that gives me 7. So 35 is the solution to this equation. All right, my friends, so the first example in your book that I'd like to look at together is on page 206, and it's number 9. We have 23d equals 2,392. Now, don't forget, when you have a coefficient, 23, right next to a variable, d, that's telling you to multiply those two values together, right? So if we actually have 23 times d, think to yourself, how do we undo that multiplication? Well, we use division. So what I'm going to do, because I want to isolate that variable, I want d to be all by itself, right? So we're going to take this side of our equation, 23 times d, and I'm going to divide it by 23, and 23 and 23, that will just cancel each other out, right? Which is pretty nice. But don't forget, whatever you do over here, you also need to do over here because those properties of equality, right? So in order to find out the solution to this equation, I need to know, well, what is 2,392 divided by 23? So again, my friends, we know that multiplying by 23 and then dividing by 23, that cancels that whole thing out, right? So we would just have our variable d by itself. But remember, we needed to do 2,392 divided by 23, and that gave us 104, which means that 104 is the solution to this equation. All right, the next problem that I would like to look at together is still on page 206, but now it's number 11. And it's really similar to that very first example that we did where we had m divided by 5 equaled 7, right? Because we're still doing division. This time I'm going to take y, I'm dividing it by 11, and then that gives me a quotient or an answer of 987. Now think to yourself, my friends, if I'm dividing by 11, well, how do I undo that dividing by 11? Well, you know that in order to undo division, we need to do the inverse operation or the opposite operation, which of course is multiplication. So if I multiply 11 by this side, not only will that get rid of that 11 and leave that variable all isolated by itself, but don't forget, you also need to maintain that same value. So you need to also multiply 11 and 987. All right, my friends, so remember, when we're dividing by 11 and then I multiply by 11, that cancels each other out, so we get y, which is our variable, all by itself. And then when I take 987, I multiply that by 11, the product, the answer is 10,857, which is the solution to this equation. All right, next we're going to look at page 207, number 14. And we're actually going to go above and beyond what's actually expected of us, all right? So the directions for this problem just tell us, hey, tell me what your first step is going to be, right? Or what you need to do in order to solve this. But we're going to go like all the way and actually solve it, okay? So we have t divided by 15, and that equals 3. Now think to yourself, how do we undo dividing by 15? Well, in order to undo that dividing by 15, our first step, which is actually the answer for the question that it's asking you, is that you would multiply by 15. But here's our above and beyond part, right? We know that not only do we need to multiply this side of my equation by 15, but because I want to keep my equal sign valid, I want to keep this equation balanced, I will also need to multiply 15 by this side of my equation as well. So now my question for you, my friends, what's the solution for t? What value does t have that would make this equation true? It's 45. So we know that when we multiply 15 after dividing by 15, that cancels each other out. That just becomes t, right? So t is all by its lonesome. But when we take 3 and multiply it by 15, our final answer is 45. That means that 45 is the solution to this equation. All right, my friends, so the last example I'd like to look at together is on page 207, and it's number 22. And in this story problem, it's telling us that after 12 weeks of yard work, our friend Felipe earns $4,500. And it wants to know, well, what equations could we use to represent this situation and that we could eventually use to solve to figure out how much money he makes in 1 week. So I'm going to use m as our variable because the book tells me to use that, right? But m is going to equal 1 week, right? How much moolah he makes in 1 week. And so we know one way we could solve this is to take the grand total, the amount that he actually earns at the end of 12 weeks, which is 4,500, and we can divide that by the number of weeks that he actually works, which is 12. But wait, there's more. We could also say that I could take the grand total, the complete amount of money that he earns, $4,500, and that's equivalent or equal to 12 weeks times the amount that he earns each week. But wait, there's more. We could also say that 12 is equivalent or equal to the total amount of money that he earned, $4,500, divided by the amount that he gets in 1 week. Remember, my friends, it doesn't matter which equation you choose. As long as you perform the operations, you're going to get the same solution for m. So I decided that I want to use multiplication. So I am going to start with the equation 4,500 is equivalent to 12 times m, right? 12 number of weeks that he worked, m the amount of money that he earns in each week. And how do we undo multiplying by 12? Well, we divide by 12, right? And don't forget, whatever you do to this side of my equation, I also need to do to this side of my equation to keep that nice and balanced, right? And we know that when we multiply by 12, but then I divide by 12, that just cancels each other out. So we'd get m all by its lonesome. So now let's think, well, if I have $4,500 and I divide that into 12 weeks, how much money did he make each week? So our friend earns $375 per week, which is m. That means that 375 is the solution to this equation. All right, my friends, that was just a quick run through of solving these equations with multiplication and division. As always, if you have any other questions, please let me know.